Okay, now with that same database guide, I've input a whole lot of data, and this is going to be our population analysis section. So you'll see that there's just a lot more rows here. The same thing that I did for myself when I copied my database report into this guide for comparison, I've now done not only for my individual opponents in the Legend Showdown, so Fedor, Philizmiz, Flushy, and Make Boyfin, but also an alias called All Opponents, where I've combined all of their stats together for analysis in general. So this accomplishes a few things. One, with all opponents, I can do more reflection on my own game, but from an exploitative point of view. When I'm determining what my game plan wants to look like, I can scan through my background data for ideas on what's going to work just in general or what's going to work against most opponents. The other thing that I can do is if I'm playing someone for a long period of time, if I'm regularly playing, for example, in small player pool 6 max, where I want to analyze a few key opponents, I can look at their individual stats, I can highlight their individual tendencies, and I can game plan specifically for that opponent. So these are two different approaches to exploitative use of data, and I'll show you kind of the very quick version of both. Again, we're not working with a lot of sample here, so there's going to be a lot of stuff that I ignore or wouldn't trust, but I've copied in all of the information that I have regardless so that we can talk about what that looks like. So first thing, looking at preflop, what I'm going to do is I'm going to scan through my individual opponents. So starting from here, I'm going to scan through my individual opponents and I'm going to look for potential weaknesses or potential anomalies in the data. I noticed that Fedor and Make Boyfin were the only ones who had pre-flop tendencies that stood out to me. Again, these are very small samples, but I think, this can very easily be checked by reviewing the actual showdowns. So what was curious about them is that their fold to 3-bet was quite low and their 4-bet was quite high. Now, I remember some hands specifically against Fedor that corroborate that this was not variance, that this is just the way he was playing pre-flop. I'm not so sure about Make Boyfin. That's something that I would have to check. Then just kind of looking through everyone's c-betting tendencies. I think this is very common across the board. I'm someone who c-bets flop a lot less than my typical opponent. I don't know if this has changed over the last couple of years, but in my experience in heads up, people c-bet the flop too much in 3-bet pots, and this seems to be true of every single opponent. So I'm just going to mark that rather than marking everyone individually because it's not a unique tendency. I'm just going to mark that on the alias here, the all opponents section. So what that tells me is I need to study the approach to counter high c-betting in 3-bet pots. This might change the way that I approach reviewing 3-bet pots because I don't want to assume that I'm facing so many checks or having so many float bet situations. I might want to study raising flops because I'm going to be in more facing c-bet situations or just defending flops in general, right? And this is where knowing your population overlaps with knowing yourself. So I might be looking at this in conjunction with this over here, fold to flop c-bet. I don't know if I have, I don't have raise flop in this report, but these are now really important stats for me. Fold the flop c-bet and 3-bet pot, and also raise flop c-bet and 3-bet pot, something I could filter for in research. This needs to be good because I'm facing more c-bets than I'm supposed to. Also, everyone is 3-betting adequately, or at least enough. It seems maybe even slightly too much, but not by enough to cause any concern for me. Fold to 4-bet also looks fine. So again, scanning through here, does anything jump out about an individual opponent? I mean, maybe Philizmiz has a lower aggression single raise pot strategy. Is it all that significant? Not really. Something that I could like thinking about how flop C betting impacts other lines, I'm thinking, okay, how do they respond to check raise? Well, now I've got some interesting results. So fold to flop check raise across the board was very high. This has to be noted. And the only player who was not making that mistake over this sample was Flushy. So I think in this case, it's not that important that I tag everyone individually. But these two players here, MakeBoyFin and Philizmies, have a particularly high fold to flop check raise over this sample. So something I want to look into. Now, knowing myself that my flop check raise is not that high, this could have been a sample size issue, but still something that I want to keep an eye on. Everyone's flop check raise was good. I'm not going to be looking too much at like river c-bet over this sample. Even turn c-bet is very questionable. What I want to look at is I want to start with the alias. So I want to start with the biggest sample that I have and see if everyone has a tendency. I don't see anything huge for turns and rivers on the overall sample. No massive. River c-bet might be slightly low, but even that over 3,000 hands is not a lot of data. Check raising for everyone looks fine. So again, looking at this individually over 750 hand or 1,500 hand samples is probably not worthwhile. Moving on to fold to c-bet. All opponents did pretty well on flops. Turn, surprisingly low on both. So this is noteworthy. And also this, little bit of additional evidence that their fold to river c-bet was collectively high. So marking this as a potential opportunity for my game plan to underbluff turns and overbluff rivers. Maybe. I mean, I would want to look at what's happening on the river c-betting situation. This could be a function of that overbetting that I was talking about when I reviewed my own game. I do a lot of folding to river c-bet as well, so it could just be that sizing's quite big here, but this is unusual to me. The fold to turn c-bet being this low, and pretty much everyone showed that same tendency. Maybe Philizmies, even this, like the bigger data set, the big blind sample is underfolding. So my suspicion here is that my opponents on average are underfolding this situation. Turn probing on average was very similar to my own, which I agree is low compared to the data here. This could show a stylistic difference, right? So Philizmies and Flushy might be playing a more similar style to myself, whereas Fedor and MakeBoyFin might be playing a more similar style to the solver. I don't really know for sure. River follow-through is also an indicator here. On average, the river follow-through was just pretty normal. So I don't think there's a lot for me to exploit in this area, at least not without specific hand research. Facing turn probe, on average, not a ton of folding until the river. River fold, kind of noteworthy. I think this is a potential area to take advantage. Everyone across the board was folding that river spot kind of a lot. Was I overbetting in this particular line? I'm not sure. This is why I mark it to go in and research that later. River probe looks pretty normal. No big deviations among the different players. Fold to river probe, maybe slightly high. The only player who jumps out here with an extremely low number is Fedor. It's interesting because what's worth pointing out is that Flushy and Philizmies are the two players that I have the biggest sample against. So my sample against them, I believe, is 1,500 hands and 2,250 hands or something along those lines. Maybe each of them actually 2,250 hands. Yeah. So I have the biggest samples against Philizmies and Flushy, which means that their data should be somewhat reliable in this area. And this is a pretty high fold to river probe, mainly because I do a lot of block betting in this line. So this is Not necessarily an area to exploit everyone, but potentially an area to exploit these two opponents. Float betting. Again, the flop, this is where we're getting into the section where my stats needed manual work to find the numbers. I'm not going to go in and do every stat again for all of these opponents, but I just want you to get the basic walkthrough of how I would analyze their potential leaks. The turn float on average was reasonable, leaning slightly high. Fedor and MakeBoyFin leaning aggressive here. Maybe worth noting. Potential check raise opportunity against these players. But this is a pretty rare spot. So I'm guessing these samples are not great. But I do still want, because the deviation is so large, I do still want to take note of these areas. Because float turn is, there's a lot of situations in 3-bet pots where the difference between double barreling and check raising all in is not that big in theory. So if someone has a clear tendency, then that's going to move the needle for you in that decision point, right? If you have two options that are close in theory, all of the work that we're doing here should dictate the way that you lean, not a randomizer. Fold to turn float on average. I see I have this in the wrong column. Looks pretty fine. Maybe slightly low, but so is mine. Delay turn c-bet on average, slightly low. Especially from the big blind, although that's not as important because they c-bet the flop too much. But delay c-bet from in position being slightly low, that's noteworthy. Everyone leaning low here. So I will tag that. This could indicate an imbalance towards value, although it's hard to tell. This isn't a huge deviation from the optimal number, but this is something worth checking into because this is an area where I'm playing, roughly optimal defense, both with raising and with calling. And I don't necessarily want to do that if there's an imbalance here. So that's tagged for research. And then their fold to delay c-bet on average is looking a little low. And is anyone in particular too low here? So Flushy showing very low in this line. And everyone else looking kind of normal. So he's really dragging the stat here. And that's an important one to mark. The other thing, so this correlates with probe turn. If his probe turn strategy is also passive, so a lot of checking, which it is, then that supports the idea that this is valid. I'd be curious to see how much raising he's doing in this line as well, to see if this is a passive defense or aggressive defense, because that would change the way I approach this exploit. So if he's underfolding, but also under raising, then we want to attack with value here. We want to value bet too thin in this line. But if he is underfolding and raising too aggressively, then this is a spot where we want to avoid his range because he's probably checking too strong of a range in an effort to check raise too much. And that means that my incentive to bet from in position without just an excellent hand is not there. I don't want to get check raised when I have thin value, and I don't want to get overcalled when I have a bluff. So I would just play this line. I would play my flop check, showdown bound, and I would check the turn too much. And that way I get to showdown more often because he's not probing the turn enough. And we take advantage of his tendency to go for this like trappy delayed check raise kind of thing. So it's one of those two strategies. It's funny because they're very different. So more research necessary here to figure out the best exploit if we want to play very passive against this strategy, or if we want to play very heavy thin value against this strategy. The river follow through, not looking super interesting. Pretty standard river follow through here. And that is all of the stats that I copied in here. Great. So again, what I would do, two things. In the all opponents section, I would review what I've marked here to come up with a general counter approach to a tough heads up opponent. One thing I would know is this flop c-bet and 3-bet pots is too high, so I need to strategize around this. Fold to flop check raise is maybe too high, which could change the way that I want to check raise flops. And fold to turn c-bet was notably low, which is really going to change the structure that I go with for my c-betting strategy. Those are probably the most important areas that we identified on average. This like fold river after call turn probe being slightly high, not the most amazing bluff opportunity, especially if they don't fold that much on the turn in the first place. They're also c-betting flop a lot, so this doesn't come up very often. So this is low priority. This is not going to get a lot of my attention. And this delayed c-bet being low is also not going to get a lot of my attention. There's no amazing exploit here, other than the fact that I can check out of position with a slightly less protected range, knowing that I won't face that much aggression in that line. So I don't need to protect my turn checks that much. I maybe just want to be more upfront aggressive. Maybe you start overbet probing as an adjustment to this. The adjustment is going to happen before we check the turn to that opponent. And that's about it. The individual adjustments, of course, can be specifically game planned to the degree that you would like. I would go in and I would do some research on these opponents and I would write up notes on what their profile is. But a lot of this needs to be confirmed. These are small samples, so much of this needs to be confirmed through hands. I'll maybe show, to wrap up this video, one example of how I would do that. So one of the most unusual things I found here was this fold to flop check raise was super high. For Phil Ismies and Make Boy Fin, it was extremely high. For all opponents on average, it was high. So we're going to go into Poker Tracker, we're going to investigate this, and we're going to see if we can come up with confirmation or challenging information to this idea. So the first thing I did here I just have, I had to alias everyone to somebody. So I just chose Crown Up Guy for whatever reason and added everyone else to this alias. So this is all the data. And then I filtered for a flop c-bet situation. So just to make sure that my stats were accurate, this is small blind, single raise pot, presumably, flop c-bet, folds check raise here, 54% overall. Now you can see there that it's a sample of 69 hands, so not the most reliable, but still a pretty good indicator, I would think. And what we're going to do, because there's only 69 check raises, is I'm going to switch over to the hand report. And I'm not going to bother filtering here. I'm just going to look at all hands, and I'm going to sort this table by flop action. And that way we can see the bet 3 bets, the bet folds, and the bet calls all in one place. Anything below this line, there was no raise on my part, so there was no further action. So the nice thing here is we can see, first of all, what are they fighting back with? In some of these hands, just making sure these are actually 3-bet pots. Yes, they are. So and I'm just going to remind myself, I think the two players who had notably high fold to check raise were Phil Ismies and Make Boy Fin. So here is a hand, I mean, this one's interesting. Phil Ismies 3-bets the flop with ace queen high. Certainly not a hand that has to 3-bet, but definitely a hand that shouldn't fold. Here, this is a 3-bet pot. So let me make sure that 3-bet pots do not get added into here. Okay, so just added some filters to have them raise pre-flop and not get 4-bet. So that means we're playing single raise pots here. Good. So now, actually just gonna, because I changed the formation here, I just want to see if the stat changed significantly. No, it did not. We're still seeing 53% fold to check raise, which is good. So looking at this, obviously we can't learn anything from the bet fold scenarios. But what we can do is we can look at counter evidence. Or we can search for counter evidence. So we can see the bet call and look at all the hands that showed down. So here we can see a bet call with trips, really no info. But here, this one, catches my eye. Here's a flop check raise that gets called by king 7 off. So right away, I see an example of a hand that is probably supposed to fold to the check raise. That's not folding to the check raise. And the sizing is pretty substantial here. Of course, you could always go into PioSolver and run this hand and see if you agree that the call is light, but this is just my instinct that this is a light call. This one doesn't strike me as too interesting. Same with pair of 10, same with trips, like ace queen high. Yeah, I mean, it's not that interesting. But this king 7 is a pretty strong piece of counter evidence to the idea that Flushy is overfolding to flop check raises. Here we see a pair, a pair, a pair, pair, top pair, over pair. Yeah, I mean, nothing substantially light here. So that's also what I'm looking for is how many of the hands that call flop are light? I only found one. So I would say that there's reasonable evidence here that my opponents are missing some light calls against flop check raise. The combination of the data and the fact that there's only one light looking hand in this whole data set. Now, there's a few like marginal ones too. The ace queen high on low boards, but these are, I think for any heads up player, these are relatively easy to find. The next thing to check to confirm or I guess deny the idea that my opponents are overfolding to flop check raise. So what would lead to overfolding flop check raise in the first place? What might lead to this is checking behind the flop with too many hands that could have bet called. So the other place to look is in their checks. So I'm going to filter for that. So here's the other side of this. We're looking at missed c-bet in single raise pots. One area to look to support the idea that they're checking too strong is how much they're folding to turn probe. So if we look at this 38% fold, it's a pretty well protected range. I don't do a lot of small betting in this area, which means to me that this range is pretty strong, pretty showdown bound. Also winning a fair bit of showdowns in this area when they do call down. Fold to river bet. Yeah, I mean, everything looking kind of reasonable there. So there's a little bit of evidence here that there's some strong hands. And what we can do again is we can look for hole cards. So looking at turn action really doesn't matter what the turn action is, actually. I'm just going to scan through hands that checked back the flop in the first place. So, any surprising hands that show up in here that could have c-bet. For example, having a checking range here on 9-9-10, a board that a lot of people would just c-bet very, very often. Now we've checked behind this texture with ace-jack, which is good enough to go for value and is good enough to call a check raise. Could, again, be supporting evidence for the flop fold to check raise being so high. Now on those same boards, I'm guessing that a lot of the trash hands are still going to c-bet. So that could be contributing. Again, here we see, now we see a balancing check back with ace-jack from Flushy. And this was one of the players who had high fold to flop check raise. So I'm seeing a bit of a story develop here that this player is checking behind flops with showdown value and then also checking back with stronger hands than that to protect that showdown value. And are we seeing enough check back hands with trash? It might even be helpful to look at just some of the lower cards. So I'm just going to scan some of these trash hands to see how often they're checking behind. And this is going to be helpful in figuring out. This is a different opponent, but it is an example of a trash hand checking behind. But trash is fairly common, right? These hands should be checking behind at a reasonable frequency and finding their way into other lines. we saw that our opponents were delayed c-betting less than they're supposed to on average, and this could also be because that check back range is lacking some of that true air. So definitely seeing some. But just on average, like not quite as much trash as I would expect. You know, this is a bit hard to quantify. I mean, here's a good example of Flushy checking behind marginal trash, some backdoor hope, something that doesn't want to get check raised. This again, though, could be pointing to an overall structure, right? Like hands that don't want to get check raised going into the checking range. If this is always the case, then we're going to see a lot of easy hands, easy decisions, just bet folding. Here's probably the first example I see of like a true nothing, true garbage checking behind the flop. Seems to be pretty reasonably played. And the last thing that I will check, I'm just going to go back to the overall stat report. So yeah, the last interesting thing here is that Flushy's Flushy was not overfolding to flop check raise. So I had that wrong. He's actually the only one over this sample who was playing quite sticky against flop check raise. And with what I was seeing from him checking behind mostly with hands that don't want to face the check raise. So that's going to bias his betting range towards hands that can continue against the check raise. Yes, I had this somewhat backwards. So the hands that I was focusing on with Flushy, that does not reflect someone who's overfolding to flop check raise. It was Philizmies and Make Boyfriend specifically. That's my mistake. So I'm actually going to go back and I'm going to look, because what I'm expecting to see is I'm expecting to see either in Philizmies or Make Boyfriend's lines, if these numbers are true, I'm expecting to see somewhere down the betting line that started from the flop, a lot of really trashy hands that would have had to fold to the flop check raise. So that's the last way to look for these showdowns, is to see what hands are showing up at showdown that bet the flop. I didn't raise, but we got to showdown some other way. So what I added here, just to make it less data to look at, was a filter for hand strength on flop. So I filtered out all pairs from this data set, and now we're just looking at c-bets that were made from high card hands on flop. Yeah, now in hindsight, looking at Flushy calling the King 7 off against check raise, now I realize that it was obvious that his fold to check raise was not too high. So looking at high card hands, we're also trying to, just scan through here to see, hands like this, for example. So this is one of our opponents who is overfolding to flop check raise. And here we see an example of just pure trash betting the flop, which is fine. Like, it's not that you're never supposed to bet pure trash. But here again, a6 off, probably a pretty high checking frequency hand, a hand that cannot call check raise. Looking also for, so a good number of these are from Philizmies, a bit of supporting evidence so far to show that these hands, a lot of them, show that these hands that cannot hold up to check raise, there's just no way that any of these combinations that I'm looking at here could call check raise. Yeah. So I think there's a good chunk of supporting evidence here. Oh, I see. I'm probably just looking at a particular date where he was the only opponent that I played. So I'm seeing a lot of his hands in succession. Yeah. So it's not that he's the only one who's doing this. It's just that I'm looking at a set of hands filtered by date that are against him. There's a good chunk of pure air in that set there. Let's look at who we've got here. This is probably the other match. We played multiple sessions. So utilizing hands that have blocker impact, utilizing hands that are good if I never check raise the flop. They're good c-bets if I never check raise the flop. But that's a pretty good bit of evidence that adjusting towards a heavier flop check raise, especially with bluffs, is going to be quite effective. So Flushy, we already determined, was underfolding to, just playing really tough against check raise. Let's see if we can get a different session in here. That's all from the 8th. Let's look at the 1st. First was also against Flushy. I played him on 2 separate occasions in the showdown, once in the round robin and once in the semifinals. So here's against Make Boyfriend. these hands here. So he was the other opponent who was folding quite a bit to check raise. So here's one, king 6 off on this board, choosing a big size. So certainly not going to get check raised that much when he chooses the big size. But perhaps, if I saw enough of this kind of airball quality hand strength choosing the big size, then I would start check raising it a lot more for sure. So there's, again, pretty good evidence that the hand selection that's happening here is just a little bit too airball heavy, a little bit too much of that hand strength that really can't do anything against a check raise. So this works fine against the strategy that I was playing, which was relatively low in check raise volume. But if I had the opportunity to review these hands and then play this opponent again, I would certainly be shifting my strategy towards more flop check raising, because a lot of these hands are pretty hopeless when faced with a check raise. And they're not exactly trash either. Like, there's a good number of hands in here that are not trash, like the 9-6 or the Queen 4, but facing check raise, they have to fold. So I think that should do it for my review on how to do this exploitative style of research. Hopefully you got some good ideas for how to use the data that you have in Poker Tracker or whatever program it is that you're using. And not only just to evaluate your own game, also to evaluate your opponents and plan for how to adjust to the weaknesses that you find.